Welcome to a special edition of Neural Wings, your source for Kalamazoo Wings game analysis and predictions, brought to you by absolutely no one. I'm your host, Ano, and today we're continuing our four-part series examining the Kalamazoo Wings season from a statistical lens. In our first episode, we introduced you to the defensive efficiency ratio and showed you how powerful it is as a predictor of season outcomes. We examined Game 14 from last season, the point of no return, where the K-Wings' DER crossed 1.00 and they never recovered. Today, we're going to tell you what the numbers say about where the current season is heading, and we're going to be honest about what it means for the red, white, and blue. Part 1. Understanding the early warning window. What is the early warning window? The early warning window is the critical period between Games 14 and 17, typically mid to late November in the ECHL schedule. This is when DER begins to show its predictive power with devastating clarity. Here's what we learned from last season's analysis. If a team's DER crosses 1.00 during this window and stays there for 3 to 4 games, and if they drop below 4th place and can't recover within 5 games, they're in serious trouble. History doesn't look kindly on teams in that position. Last season, the K-Wings hit this window in Game 14 on November 23rd. Their DER crossed 1.00 that night. They dropped to 5th place. And here's the kicker. They never made it back to the playoff line. Not once. Not for the remaining 58 games of the season. The early warning window didn't lie. It never does. Why this window matters. At this point in the season, roughly 20% complete, you have enough data for meaningful patterns to emerge, but you still have 80% of the season ahead of you. Theoretically, there's plenty of time to recover. A team could go on a hot streak, shore up their defense, turn the whole thing around. But the statistics tell a very different story. Our analysis showed that by Game 17, teams were essentially locked into their trajectory. If your DER was above 1.10 at that point, you finished outside the playoffs. Every single time. No exceptions. The correlation coefficient between DER and final standings reaches 0.945 in the first quarter of the season. For those who don't live and breathe statistics, let me translate. That's not just strong correlation. That's near deterministic prediction. When something has a 0.945 correlation, you're essentially looking at cause and effect. Your DER at Game 17 doesn't just predict your final position, it practically defines it. The November Rule. We identified what we call the November Rule, and it's brutally simple. Teams that maintain a sub 1.00 DER through November typically make the playoffs. Teams that don't typically don't. It's that straightforward. Last season, the K-Wings posted a November DER of 1.77, by far their worst month of the entire season. They earned just 25% of available points that month. November alone defined their season. And here's why November performance is disproportionately predictive. It's where the early warning window sits. It's where teams either prove they belong in the playoff conversation or prove they don't. The lag effect. There's one crucial thing you need to understand about how DER works. The changes don't immediately show up in the standings. There's what we call a lag effect, typically 2 to 3 games. A team can have a terrible defensive stretch. They might give up 5 goals one night, 6 goals the next, but they might not drop in position for a few games. The standings haven't caught up yet. Conversely, a strong recovery takes time to translate into standings movement. You can play great defensive hockey for a week and still be stuck in the same position you were before. This lag effect is precisely why the 5-game window is so critical in our analysis. Sustained trends over 5 games have the strongest correlation with position changes, We're talking about a 0.689 correlation coefficient. Single games are just noise in the system. Two-game stretches are still mostly noise. But five-game trends? That's signal. That's real. That's the defensive efficiency pattern showing itself clearly enough that it starts to move teams up or down in the standings. Part 2. Current Season Reality Check. Now, let's talk about right now. Let's talk about the 2025 to 2026 season, 16 games in. And I'm going to be direct with you. What I'm about to share isn't pleasant, but it's what the data tells us. Current Standings Breakdown. Let me walk you through the current Central Division standings and, more importantly, what the DER values tell us about each team's trajectory. At the top of the division, Fort Wayne leads with 27 points through 18 games. But here's what really matters. Their DER is 0.61. Think about what that means. For every goal they score, they're allowing just 0.61 goals. That's not just good defense, that's championship-level defense. They're not just making the playoffs, they're winning the division. Book it. In second place, Toledo sits with 21 points and a DER of 0.84. Last season's champion finished with a 0.83 DER. Toledo is on that exact same trajectory. They're a playoff lock. Third place belongs to Cincinnati with 21 points. But here's where it gets interesting. Their DER is 1.05. They're allowing more goals than they score. They're above the critical 1.00 threshold. Fourth is Bloomington with 20 points and a DER of exactly 1.00. These two teams, Cincinnati and Bloomington, are right on the edge. One will likely claim third place, the other fourth. They're viable playoff teams, but they're on the bubble. They're one bad week away from falling off. And then we get to the bottom three. Indy sits in fifth with 19 points and a DER of 1.19. Iowa is sixth with 16 points and a 1.26 DER. Both are in what we call the danger zone. When you're above 1.10, playoff odds drop precipitously. They'd need significant improvement to climb back into contention. And then there's Kalamazoo, seventh place, 12 points through 16 games, DR of 1.28. Let me say that again, because it needs to sink in. 1.28. The K-Wings are allowing 1.28 goals for every goal they score. That's not just bad. That's historically catastrophic for a team with playoff aspirations. The historical comparison that should terrify you. Here's the comparison that really tells the story. Last season at Game 16, the K-Wings had a DER around 0.90 and were sitting in second or third place in the division. They were in a playoff position. They looked competitive, and they still finished fifth with a final DER of 1.14. This season at Game 16, they have a DER of 1.28 and are in seventh place. They're starting from a significantly worse position than they did last year. They're already deeper in the hole than they ever were last season, and we're barely 20% into the schedule. Think about the mathematics of this for a moment. Last season, starting from a decent position, they couldn't recover. This season, starting from a terrible position, somehow they're supposed to stage a miraculous comeback? The numbers don't support that narrative. Part 3. Is recovery possible? So let's address the question everyone wants answered. Can the K-Wings salvage this season? And the answer, as it often is with complex questions, depends entirely on your definition of success. Let's break it down mathematically and talk about what's actually possible versus what's probable. The statistical reality. From last season's comprehensive data analysis, we know several critical facts. Teams with a DER above 1.20 had a 22% win rate. That's winning roughly 1 out of every 5 games. No team recovered from a DER above 1.20 to make the playoffs. Not one. The K-Wings are currently at 1.28. So, is it statistically impossible for them to make the playoffs? No. Nothing is truly impossible in sports. But is it statistically improbable? Absolutely. We're talking about an outcome that has no historical precedent in our data set. Scenario 1. Making the playoffs. Let's start with the optimistic scenario. To make the playoffs, the K-Wings need to finish 4th or better in the division. Based on last season's analysis, that requires a season-ending DER below 1.08. They're currently at 1.28 after 16 games. To finish at 1.08 over a full 72-game season, they would need to post a DER of approximately 0.95 for the remaining 56 games. Let me put that in concrete terms so you understand what we're talking about. A 0.95 DER over 56 games means this. If they average 2.5 goals scored per game, which is reasonable offensive production, they'd score about 140 goals over those remaining games. To maintain a 0.95 DER, they could allow 133 goals against. That works out to 2.375 goals against per game. For context, last season, Toledo won the championship, while allowing 2.69 goals per game. The K-Wings would need to play better defense than last year's champions while maintaining solid offensive production for 56 consecutive games, without a significant slump. My probability assessment for this scenario? Less than 10%, and I'm being generous with that 10%. Scenario 2. Staying competitive. A more realistic goal might be finishing 5th, avoiding the basement, staying competitive, building some positive momentum for next season. Last season's 5th-place team, which happened to be the K-Wings themselves, finished with a 1.14 DER. To hit that mark from their current 1.28, they'd need approximately a 1.05 DER over the remaining games. This is achievable, but it's still difficult. It would require consistent 3-2 and 4-3 victories, occasional shutouts, or dominant wins to offset the bad games, and, most critically, avoiding blowout losses. Remember what we learned last season? Games where they allowed 5 or more goals had a record of 1 win, 13 losses, and 3 overtime losses. Every 7-2 defeat or 6-1 shellacking absolutely destroys your DER, and it takes 3 or 4 solid defensive performances to dig out of that hole. My probability assessment for finishing 5th? About 30 to 35%. It's possible. It requires discipline and consistency, but it's within reach. Scenario 3. The current trajectory. And then there's the most likely scenario, the one where the K-Wings continue roughly at their current pace. If they maintain a DER around 1.28, the formula predicts a 5th-place finish, but realistically, they could easily slip to 6th or 7th. At a 1.28 DER, they're allowing 28% more goals than they score. That's not a recipe for success in a tight competitive division. That's not a recipe for climbing the standings. That's a recipe for exactly what we're seeing right now. Sitting at the bottom of the division, struggling to find wins. My probability assessment for this scenario? 60 to 65%. This is the most likely outcome if nothing changes. What would recovery actually look like? For the K-Wings to recover from this position, they would need to do something they failed to do all of last season. sustain a sub 1.00 DR for an extended period. Multiple weeks, maybe months. Last season, they had a perfect 31-0 record in games where their single-game DER was below 1.00. Perfect. They need to create more of those games. They need to win games 2-1. They need to win games 3-2. They need to embrace defensive hockey and grind out victories instead of getting into track meets where they're trading chances and ultimately giving up more than they score. Here's what recovery requires, broken down into specific, actionable elements. First, immediate defensive tightening. The next 5 games are absolutely critical. If they can post a 5-game DER around 0.80 to 0.90, that signals a real turnaround. That means winning games 3-2 and 4-2, not 5-4 or 6-5. Low-scoring, defensive victories. Second, they must eliminate blowout losses. Last season, games where they allowed 5 or more goals resulted in 1 win, 13 losses, and 3 overtime losses. Every time they lose 7-2 or 6-1, they're not just losing 2 points in the standings, they're poisoning their DER for the next several games. It takes multiple strong defensive performances to recover from one bad blowout. Third, they need to win the low-scoring games. Championship teams win 2-1. They win 1-0. They win 3-2. The K-Wings need to embrace that style of hockey. They need to accept that not every game will be high-flying offensive entertainment, and that's okay. Sometimes the best hockey is boring hockey, the kind where you shut down the opponent's offense and capitalize on your limited chances. And fourth, they need to capitalize on home ice. Last season, their home DER was 1.00 compared to 1.29 on the road. That's a massive difference. They need to absolutely dominate at Wings Event Center. Make it a fortress where visiting teams struggle to score, and then steal whatever points they can on the road. Banking home points is essential when your road performance is that much worse. The November test. We're living through right now. Here's what makes this moment so critical. We're in the November window right now. We're living through the early warning period as we speak. Remember the November rule. Teams that maintain a sub 1.00 DER through November make the playoffs. The K-Wings' current trajectory puts them well above that threshold. At 128, they're nowhere close to 100. The next 3 weeks will likely determine the entire season. If they can finish November with a DER below 1.15, there's hope. They're still alive. They're still in the conversation. But if they finish November above 1.30, if they keep bleeding goals at this rate, they can start planning for next year. They can start thinking about draft position and off-season moves because the playoff ship will have sailed. Final assessment. So, here's my final assessment, based purely on what the data tells us. Can the K-Wings make the playoffs from their current position? The statistics say it's highly unlikely. Not impossible. Nothing is truly impossible in sports, but improbable. We're talking about an outcome that would require a level of sustained improvement that we rarely see in professional hockey. Can they finish respectably, maybe climb to 5th place, and build some positive momentum for next season? Yes, but it requires immediate and sustained improvement in defensive efficiency starting right now. Not next week. Not after the holiday break. Now. The formula has spoken with clarity. At 1.28 DER through 16 games, the K-Wings are not on a playoff trajectory. They're on a 6th or 7th place trajectory. Changing that trajectory requires dramatic, sustained improvement, the kind of turnaround that makes for great comeback stories precisely because it's so rare. But here's the thing about statistics that I always want to emphasize. They predict probability, not certainty. They tell us what's likely to happen, not what must happen. Every season has outliers. Every model has exceptions. Every seemingly doomed team that proves the skeptics wrong becomes a legend. The question facing the K-Wings is simple. Will they be the exception, or will they prove the rule? Will they become the feel-good story of a team that defied the mathematics? Or will they become another data point, confirming that DER is as predictive as we believe it is? The next 5 games will start to give us that answer. Next time, we'll examine the lock-in point, and after that statistical certainty, windows, the moments when the season's outcome becomes nearly inevitable, when the mathematics stop being predictive and start being descriptive, when hope gives way to acceptance. Well, that's it for today. If you like this content, please like, subscribe, and tell a friend. It helps out more than you know. I'm Ano, and this is Neural Wings. Let's go, K-Wings.